All right, so I've been given the high sign to start. I wanted to say hello to everybody. My name is Philip Young. I'm the president and CEO of World Affairs here in San Francisco. And I would like to welcome all of you to our program, just to make sure you know that you're in the right space. And it's entitled Advancing Community Rights Through Peacebuilding, which we are so pleased and proud to host with the Accountability Counsel. I've got a really easy job, is just to welcome you really quickly and introduce your host. I want to introduce Beth Ann Schak, who will be moderating today's program. Beth is a visiting professor of human rights at Stanford Law School and a visiting scholar at the Center of International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University. That's a great organization. I was part of that a long, long time ago.
Oh, yeah.
Beth also is a former deputy to the Ambassador at Large for War Crimes Issues in the Office of Global Criminal Justice at the U.S. Department of State. So with that, let me ask Beth to take it from here. Beth, thank you and welcome.
Great. Thank you so much, Philip, and welcome everyone. It's great to see you here and see so much interest in these important issues. We're going to be talking about using peace-building tools and the role of accountability in promoting peace in resource conflicts around the world. And we've got a great set of speakers here to talk a little bit about their work in this space. They're both from Accountability Counsel, based here in San Francisco. Natalie Bridgman Fields is the executive director of Accountability Counsel, and she founded this organization several years ago. It's a global nonprofit that amplifies individuals' voices and communities' voices who are trying to defend their environmental and human rights around the world. She's worked as a lawyer for many years, supporting communities to challenge abuses in dozens of countries around the world. She's also taught a number of courses at law schools and universities, and has been recognized for her social entrepreneurship with an Echoing Green Fellow and a Draper Richards Kaplan Foundation Entrepreneur Award. Previously, she served as a consultant on accountability for 2 international financial institutions, and earlier in her career, where we first met actually years ago, she litigated a number of corporate human rights and environmental cases here in the United States in US courts. We're also going to hear from Caitlin Daniel, who's a senior associate on Accountability Counsel's communities team. She assists communities affected by international development projects to access and use accountability offices. She's worked extensively with communities in Asia, Africa, Eastern Europe, and Latin America, all of whom have been affected by extractive, energy, agribusiness, and other public infrastructure projects. Previously, she was with the Lawyers Association for Human Rights of Nepalese indigenous peoples in Nepal, where she was working to defend the rights of indigenous groups harmed by large-scale development projects. And she's also worked as an associate in an immigration law firm. So with this team on the call, we're focusing here on the theme of how to effectively leverage accountability as a peacekeeping tool for resource conflicts. And it's often assumed that peace and accountability cannot both be achieved in some of these conflicts because they're indelibly in tension with each other. And the work of Accountability Counsel really shows that this is a fallacy, that in fact, peace and accountability can both be achieved, and that they can and often do, in fact, reinforce each other. So I'd like to start with a short clip called "The When the Dust Came In" by Abhi Singh about nomadic herders in Mongolia who are supported by Accountability Counsel to build peace through conflict with a mining giant, Rio Tinto, whom you may have heard about. They've been involved in a number of resource conflicts around the world where they've been sued in US courts and elsewhere. And the work of Accountability Counsel really achieved a tremendous outcome for this community that was, to coin a sort of phrase, a win-win for all sides. So here's the film.
Бас бэлчээрэн дээрсэн болж одоо малчич хоорондоо их маргалдаж бас хэцүү болж байгаа шүү. Бэлчээр шахагдсан салхи ороо уур амьсгал бол эрсэл өөрчлөгдсөн доо оюутлага орж ирснээс хойш бол ирнэ.
The International Finance Corporation have an accountability office called the Compliance Advisor Ombudsman, and that's who the herders turned to. They filed a complaint to them. That office, the CAO, facilitated a negotiation process between the herders, the mining company, and the local government.
Accountability Council had offered to do a training in the field for herders how to prepare for negotiations with a huge company like Rio Tinto. And we happily welcomed that. And that's when we started working together. The most important support that Accountability Council provided was to help the company and the herders communicate. At the time, the relationship was so bad that they will just scream back. With the assistance of Accountability Council, they overcame that and started communicating. This was a long process to reach an agreement. First of all, for the company to recognize the need for a remedy. That was a very long process that involved independent experts, very long discussion on the scopes of work where we really needed technical expertise, we needed legal expertise.
I went to Mongolia. I moved there for a couple of months in the winter of 2017 to be able to provide more on the ground, close support and to accompany the herders through those final stages. We helped the herders to consult with the whole herder community to develop a set of demands, think together about what they hope to achieve through this negotiation process. And that led straight into the final negotiation of those agreements.
Бид одоо энэ accountability буюу энэ тайлагналын зөвлөл гэдэг энэ байгууллагатай холбогдож бидний дэмжил энэ байгууллагын дэмжлэгийг аваагүй байсан бол бас энэ хэмжээнд хүртэлх үр дүнтэй хэлцээрт орох мэдээлэл одоо гаргасан тайлан энэ бүхэл одоо бичиг баримттай танилцах нэлээд олон юмнуудыг бол одоо мэдэхгүй.
Энэ гэрээнд бол одоо сэтгэл өндөр байгаа. Түрүүчийн 2004 онд одоо хамрагдаад чадаагүй. Одоо хамрагдаад одоо малчин биднэрт их л тус нэмтэй байгаа шүү дээ одоо. Одоо энд чинь нэг мөнгөний дэмжлэг үзүүлнэ гэсэн. Нэг баяртай л байна. Манай хоёр болохоор нэг нь цахилгаан чинь нэг нь механик. Энэ сургалтыг эхлэхээс өмнө 6-7 сарын өмнө сураг сонсчоод одоо тэр сургалтын хариуцсан өнөр бол утастаа хашираасан зүг. Зунжинга утастаал. Одоо тэгэл энэ хоёр сургалтанд цугаад тэр чиглэлээр манай хоёр хүүхд одоо тэгэл цаашаа явна. Ажилдан, амьдран, хөдөлмөрлөн тэгэл амьдрал ахуйгаа дэвшүүлнэ. Энэ сургалт бол бидний хувьд бол маш их тустай. Малчин бидний уламжилж ирсэн.
Great, thanks very much. Caitlin, maybe you can tell us a little bit about the underlying conflict to give us some context for your work in this particular community.
Sure, thanks, Beth. So, and thanks everyone for this opportunity to talk about this case. This is a case I've been working on for a long time, very dear to my heart. When the mining company first came in to the Gobi Desert, previously this was an area of Mongolia where the main livelihood, really almost everyone in the area was engaged in traditional livestock herding. It's a harsh livelihood to carry out in the Gobi Desert. You know, there are already resource constraints. There have been for generations, but nonetheless, herders have been living there for many, many years, engaging in these traditional livelihoods. In modern times, that has become more difficult with the advent of increasing desertification, climate change. And then when the mine came in and started operations in 2012, those resource constraints just became even more challenging. First, pasture resources has been a huge concern. The mine has taken up over 50,000 acres of what used to be publicly available pasture land that the herders used. Now that's taken up for the mine, and so much surrounding infrastructure. They had to build an airport, roads through the desert, transmission lines. That's been a huge issue. Another big issue is water, of course. This is a desert environment. Water resources were always scarce. Building a mine in the desert is always going to create those resource constraints and conflicts. But in this case, it was even worse because the location of the mineral deposits was right on a major ephemeral river in the area. So they had to actually divert the river to make way for the mine. And of course, that has huge impacts for the local watershed. So these types of resource conflicts have made herding in the area so much more difficult. They've led to conflicts not only with the mining company, but between local herders and each other. As resources like pasture and water become more scarce, people are starting to see increasing infighting about who's going to access those resources.
Great, and thank you. So how do you build trust in a community like this? I mean, how do you avoid appearing as if you're sort of parachuting in and then disappearing again? Obviously, they trusted you, you worked with them for a long period of time, but how do you build those relationships with the community like the herders in Mongolia?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think in our work, it's a challenge on multiple levels, right? I mean, for us coming in initially and offering support to the herders, of course, we have to build trust. And then the next level, very critical for peace building, is how are the parties going to build trust between each other? In this case, this huge mining company that's popped in and created, you know, from the herders' perspective, created this problem. How are they going to get to a point where they can sit together at a dialogue table and resolve those concerns? You know, to be honest, it took a lot of hard work for the parties. So I think it was clear in the video, but just to back up for a moment, the approach in this case that was used was a dialogue process between the herders, the mining company, and eventually they brought in the local government as an important additional party to many of the topics that were being discussed at that negotiating table. And to be honest, at the beginning, it was very challenging. You know, I mean, the process took a number of years, and I think that we saw some real transformations during that time. And, you know, I think there's a few factors that I can point to that helped with those transformations. One point that I want to highlight is the extreme power imbalance at the start of this case between the parties. Of course, you have this international mining company sitting at the table across from herders who are, you know, not professional negotiators, not used to having to fight for their rights, demand their rights at a negotiating table. And that, you know, from a peace building perspective, it's a real danger. I think in the best case scenario, these dialogue processes can lead to a fair agreement that might help to create a lasting solution between the parties. But if you don't have if you don't have the ability for parties to sit at the table on equitable terms, you might end up with an agreement that feels very unfair to one side. And that can only contribute to more frustrations, more tensions, and more conflict in the future. So a big part of our role was looking at that power imbalance and thinking about creative ways to address it, to build the herders up and make sure that they were able to negotiate on equal footing or more equal footing with the company. I think that, you know, the video got into some of those ways. A lot of it at the beginning was negotiations trainings. Throughout the process, the herders were constantly bombarded with long documents, technical documents that they had to review and understand and respond to. So we helped them a lot with just that, you know, being able to engage on more equal footing with those types of tasks. And, you know, in all of this work that we were doing from the beginning, offering our services to the herders and offering to help train them and support them in any way that they tell us that they need. That's all us as well, building trust with the herders, responding to, you know, what they say their needs are, and showing through our work that we are committed to helping them and committed to the long haul. You know, we're not an organization that comes in for a quick fix. We've been working with these herders in this case for many years. And just briefly, there's another couple of points that I wanted to touch on that the video also mentioned. One in this case was the hiring of international experts. From the beginning of the dispute, of course, the parties came to the table and they had so many factual points that they disagreed on. One example is water resources. The company said that they were not using water resources that had any impact on the waters available for herders. They said their aquifers are separate. They are not connected to the herders' water source. And the herders said, well, it's our experience over the past few years that our water has been declining since this mine came in. Of course, that puts the herders at a disadvantage. They don't have access to the tests and the international experts that the company has available to help answer these questions. So the parties decided to jointly commission a study by independent experts to help resolve these factual disputes. And, you know, I think that deciding to do that and committing to accept the findings of those experts required a lot of cooperation between the parties. I think that was a trust building process for them. And it also required some compromises on both sides. The findings ultimately did not 100% favor one party or the other. So both sides had to compromise in their views in order to say we will accept whatever findings these experts come out with. So that was a critical point. Another point I want to mention is the involvement of a skilled mediator, an independent neutral, is absolutely critical in these cases where you have, a very serious and protracted dispute that, really drives to the heart of what's important for the herders and the mining company. There's no way around it. And I think we saw in this case, and in many cases, we felt with that having a skilled independent neutral who's able to first build trust with the parties themselves and then use that trust to bring the parties closer together, able to drive the process forward when it gets stuck, and provide the parties with perspective. Why are they there? What are they working towards? And ideally also helps to balance out that power imbalance. If one of the parties is claiming that a document says X, or that that 2 meetings ago we did not agree to do Y, the independent neutral has a very important role to play in bringing in external guideposts and making sure that what's being said in the dialogue is factually correct and a strong basis for eventually negotiating a fair agreement. So I think these are all important.
That's very helpful. Thank you for all of that. By the way, I should have mentioned, if folks have questions, I have a few more questions for our panelists, but please feel free to click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and I'll moderate those at the end of the conversation that we're having here. So Caitlin, one more question for you. Can you catch us up to the present? The film has let off at the point in which this agreement is being negotiated with the communities. There's a training program in place for the young people. What is the future? What does the future hold now for this community when it comes to their livelihood, their community, their environment, et cetera, now that this agreement is in place?
Yeah, great question. I think what the video doesn't get to, the clip that we showed does not quite capture, is that ultimately through this dialogue process, the parties were able to negotiate a huge, very wide-ranging agreement with over 60 separate commitments. The herders got much of what they set out to achieve through that agreement on paper. And now, that was in June of 2017. We have been continuing to work with the herders over the past 3 years to ensure that the implementation of that huge agreement is strong and that the results that it brings in reality live up to the expectation that's been created by these great promises, these great commitments. That work is still underway. I will say there has been significant progress in the first 3 years, but some of the pieces that were easiest to progress with were things like support for individual families, like the training program that the video mentions. Some of the things that are taking longer are the commitments that maybe have the potential to be most impactful, such as a whole series of commitments to try to make herding in the Gobi more profitable, so that even with fewer resources, herders are making more money and able to sustain a reasonable livelihood with fewer animals that there will still be room for even with this big mine. That is not a small task, and so those commitments are taking more time, and it still remains to be seen, honestly, what the impact of that will be. These questions about whether herding in the Gobi will remain a viable source of livelihood are still very much live questions for the herders. And one more point on that, I just, I want to highlight, even aside from implementation progress on these agreements, peace building is a process, of course. And, while the agreements were a huge win and very much helped to flip the dynamic between herders and the mining company in a positive direction, we are in year 8, I believe, of a mine that has an expected life of over 50 years. Some expect more than 100 years. So everyone knows that there are going to be more disputes arising between these parties. And they've actually accounted for that. In the dialogue process, they set up a permanent forum that's supposed to exist for the life of the mine, with representation from herders, local government, and the mining company to resolve future disputes as they arise. And I think that's also a really important element here. Whenever you have disputes that are really, protracted, getting at very fundamental rights between the parties, you can't expect that one agreement alone is going to resolve things. I think it's important also that mechanisms and processes in place and forums for resolving inevitable disputes moving forward.
Great, thank you. Natalie, turning to you, and maybe you can situate this particular situation within a larger legal framework. Can you talk a little bit about the various accountability mechanisms that Accountability Counsel uses? This was very much your brainchild in recognizing that these had been underutilized and that communities did have avenues to seek redress and to advance their equities when it came to these particular negotiations. How do you access these? What are they? And how do we ensure that the Mongolia situation is not a one-off, that this is actually a success that can be replicated around the world?
Sure. When people think about resource conflicts and how to redress grievances around them, the first thing that most people think about is using a court, of bringing a case in a court of law. And what's unique about the system that we use is we do not use courts, but instead we use an alternative system that is still just developing. And when I was a law student myself, there was only one of these accountability offices tied to the World Bank. There are now dozens of them, and they're connected to the international financial flows that are financing and investing in the projects all around the world that can often, just one project alone, impact 1 million people at a time. So the bang for your buck, so to speak, in using these accountability offices is that they follow the money. So in the case of Mongolia, as Caitlin described, these are communities who are impacted by this massive mining project, and the mining project itself was financed by the World Bank's private sector arm, the IFC. By financing that project, it gave the communities the right to complain if there was a grievance that violated the social and environmental rules, the human rights rules around the development and operation of that project. So essentially, that's the system we have now for every multilateral development bank, many bilateral institutions, and it's a whole burgeoning system that we've also worked in our policy field to advance. So Caitlin's example was through what's called a dispute resolution process that these accountability offices offer. This accountability system is unique in that it's not totally independent, they're quasi-independent systems. So a complaint would be filed to an accountability office. That accountability office sits within the governance structure of the bank or institution that has financed a project causing harm. So while one may say, well, that's not truly independent, the benefit from having it within the structure is that they have then the power within the institution to then remedy a situation, change a project, create a benefit for a community that's been harmed. So our policy advocacy works on making sure that there's pressure on international institutions to ensure that those accountability offices are independent, fair, transparent, accessible, so that our communities lawyers like Caitlin and the others that we work with can make sure that communities can access a fair shake at being heard when there's been an international investment project that's caused harm. So not every dispute, not every resource conflict has international investment that gives rise to the ability to use an accountability office, but many, many, many do. And the number of communities successfully bringing an accountability office complaint are still far, far fewer than there should be. So our work is to make sure people know about these accountability offices as an avenue for justice, can use them effectively.
I know you've had a number of successes in places like Mexico, Myanmar, Burma. My students, in fact, worked on one of your cases through our Human Rights and International Conflict Resolution Clinic here in Mongolia, obviously. But are there limits to this model? Have you had situations where the internal accountability mechanism was simply not functional or did not end up being an effective avenue for communities that are impacted negatively by these big development projects?
Right, we have had successes. The Mongolia agreement, we've reached agreements recently in Haiti. We had an agreement, a really historic agreement we reached in Mexico. But there are examples of where dispute resolution of this kind to build peace through a really complicated, intractable, seemingly intractable conflict, that these accountability offices are not well suited to those types of disputes being resolved and to building peace in a way forward. An example is we had a case in Peru where this was a long-standing series of oil spills in the Peruvian Amazon. An indigenous community brought a complaint because the International Finance Corporation invested in the company causing the oil spills. But in that case, it really demonstrated the limitations because this is a voluntary set of mechanisms that require the people
as parties to this dispute to come to the table in good faith. And if good faith is missing on one side, in the case of our Peru complaint, there was no good faith on the part of the oil company to reach decisions with the community that would lead to a long-term solution here. That's where this is not an appropriate way to address a dispute. Also, there are types of cases that are both serious and therefore a court of law, you know, a really serious case that would require a criminal penalty. That's not well suited to this type of mechanism as well. So there are places where it's really, really helpful, where there's a set of agreements that can be creatively deployed. And that's, I think, the beauty of this, is that, as Caitlin described, the peace building effort that she's describing and that we used in our Mexico case around a hydroelectric project, the types of remedies that are possible are often not even imaginable in a court of law, because they can be not only very quickly agreed, but they can be agreed with a very flexible process that's needs driven. So a community can articulate, here's the remedy we need to build a peaceful, sustainable future, and they can build toward that in a way that's often not possible in another forum.
Great. Well, I'd love to open it up now to questions from the audience. If you'd like to put something in the Q&A chat at the bottom, I'll go ahead and read those questions to our panelists. And while the audience is having a chance to do this, Natalie, maybe you can talk a little bit about the Mexico case. You've referenced it a couple of times, and I know on the website of Accountability Council, there are a number of country studies and project studies that if people are interested, they can see the full film. The film on Mongolia is available. There's also a short clip on the Mexico case, but maybe you could talk a little bit about that while we get some questions.
Absolutely. That was a case where the risk of not having a successful process was violence. This is a case that came to us, communities requesting support from Oaxaca, Mexico, in a very kind of remote area where there was an existing dam, and an investment firm wanted to build a hydroelectric facility. But without consultation with local people, they started acquiring land and making plans to use a natural spring that was going to be lost as a result of this project. And that was a spring people used for drinking water, for fishing, and as a cultural resource, an incredibly important natural resource in the region. So as a result of filing a complaint to an accountability office tied to a US government agency that was financing this project, they were able to get, again, independent mediators to come and help the community and the company that was operating and the financial institution to come together to hire joint experts to do that fact-finding, that neutral fact-finding. And most importantly, the mediator helped the communities and the company agree that as a result of the process, the community and the company would together decide the future of the project, not just the company alone, which had been the way it was moving forward. So as a result, often in Mexico, there's violence that results from resource conflicts. And this is a case where that very well could have been what happened. But instead, through a very skillful mediated dialogue, they came to an agreement to stop the project together, because there was no viable way for it to continue while respecting the rights of the communities in Oaxaca. So it's a beautiful example, and there is a film on our website. And the full film, I really encourage you to see the full Mongolia film on our website. It's an absolutely beautiful description and storytelling of this case. So examples of what's possible.
Great. We have a really interesting question here about how to define the idea of community in terms of who your clients are. And in this particular community, your work was based with local herders, but what about herders in other parts of the South Gobi Desert who might have actually benefited in certain ways from the mine in terms of tax benefits, et cetera, contributions? Are there different forms of dialogue processes that can include layers of community and sort of circles of larger communities, even when those communities may have some conflicts between them in terms of who's going to benefit from a particular project?
Yeah, that's a great multifaceted question. Thank you, Julian. I think, so where to start? I think, as Natalie described, the dialogue process in the Mongolia case, and this is common to the cases that Accountability Council takes, it started when local herders affected by the Oyu Tolgoi mine filed a complaint to an international complaint office that's tied to one of the mine's lenders. And the herders in that complaint defined what the issues were that needed to be addressed. And the Oyu Mine agreed to enter into this dialogue process to address those concerns. When that happens, the dialogue process is pretty flexible. It's not uncommon for the parties to sit down and decide together if there is anyone else that needs to be brought into the dialogue process in order to talk about the issues that were raised in the complaint, which are the subject of that particular dialogue. In this case, that's actually, the parties did do that, and that is why the local government was brought in as a necessary party to discuss those issues that were raised by the herders. In other cases, we have seen cases where local communities have decided, multiple communities essentially have entered into a dialogue process together, even if they have slightly different views on the project. They might have also common concerns. And we've certainly seen complex scenarios in the dialogue process where the parties are trying to address multiple concerns, even when communities have different views on those topics.
And might I add just one addition to that, pulling on the Mexico case is a great example of that, is where the community in Mexico was made up of a number of villages, four villages that occupy the valley where this creek is, and not all of them had the same view going into this dispute resolution process. Some wanted the project to go forward, some really didn't know anything about the project at all, and some were very skeptical and concerned about its impact to the little bit they knew. But what they all did have in common was they all felt that they didn't have enough information to fully understand what was happening, and they wanted that. So we used that as a starting point, and communities started in the process and really changed in growing the number of communities that had things in common that they were working toward. So we started off simply as an access to information question, and then they wanted to understand what the alternatives to the project were after they understood the existing project, and then they came together to make this cohesive decision. It's not always going to be possible, and our approach is never to force anyone into anything. It's really following as much as we can an ethical, community-led movement to move forward, and that looks very different in every case, and depending on the community and what it looks like.
Another question about this idea of tension between competing imperatives that are raised by some of these big development projects. In your work in Myanmar, this was a so-called conservation project that was being implemented by the government, and yet it was severely undermining the rights of a local indigenous Karen community who had a long history of stewardship of that particular part of the country. How did you work, and this is the project that my students worked on, and they found themselves a little bit torn. On the one hand, wanting to promote this goal of conservation and to bring the Myanmar government into a recognition of our sort of collective obligation towards our shared planet. And this process that could have actually stalled or brought that project to a halt. How do you balance sort of these conservation goals with the local rights of communities who have long lived in these various areas and have their own stewardship approach to the environment, to the land, to the flora and fauna that are there?
That's an excellent question. And I think the overarching theme there is really peeling back the layer of assumptions that come with often top-down projects and listening to local people who stand to be impacted. And so that's not only very instructive to understand social and human rights impacts in projects where it seems a little bit more obvious that you need community-driven information to understand the impact. Some might think, well, a top-down conservation project, you're still going to do conservation, and maybe that's, from a utilitarian perspective better. But the perverse thing that happened in this case is that the vulnerabilities to illegal logging created by a top-down conservation effort that stood to forcibly displace Karen indigenous people who were the traditional conservators of this area actually stood to have a negative conservation effect on this region. So that by listening to communities wanting to incorporate their own traditional methods of conservation into a new alternative project is really a sustainable path forward, whereas the communities demand that the UNDP supported project going to the federal government be suspended is really out of a desire to do better ethical and really what needs to be a modern approach to conservation after learning for 50 years what can happen if you don't include community voices and the stakeholders, particularly indigenous people, the very people who are the reason these places still exist at all in many cases.
Can you maybe, building on that, speak a little bit about your work in Lamu, Kenya, where you were able to bring really to a halt what would have been a very damaging project to that local and very fragile environment.
Yeah, and Caitlin, I welcome you to come in on this point too. And that's a case where we worked really in a deep coalition with a lot of organizations in Kenya through an umbrella organization called Save Lamu over many, many years. And Caitlin's worked on this case too. And that's a case where litigation was able to be a kind of complement to an accountability office strategy. And the National Environment Tribunal of Kenya suspended the permits for this coal-fired power plant because of failure to follow social and environmental due diligence rules for this coal-fired power plant. Our role in that case has been to support the communities on understanding their right to file complaints to international accountability offices that we've described, so that they can make sure that investors see the community-driven complaints that are underlying the reasons why they believe this project should not go forward. And Caitlin, I don't know if you want to say a few words about this project too.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great summary, Natalie, as you're speaking, and just I just wanted to highlight the point that I think is coming up in some of these questions, that Accountability Counsel takes a very community-driven approach. So the work that we're doing in any of these cases, the issues that are raised, the approach taken, you know, what solutions the community wants to seek, and that often impacts what forum is going to be appropriate to seek those solutions. All of that is very community-driven. And that also ties to the point about how to define the community. That is something that would be decided very much together with the local people.
That leads quite well into the next question, which is quite timely, and that is, how are you functioning in the time of a global pandemic? So much of your work is community-based, locally led. It's premised on you really getting to know the community, working directly with them to help define their interests and then advance those interests within these accountability mechanisms. Caitlin, you mentioned that you moved to Mongolia for several months in order to be able to do this effectively and not just sort of parachute in and out. How are you able to function now, given that we're not able to travel, working out of our living rooms, et cetera?
Yeah, it's challenging. Sorry, I'll say a couple of things and pass it to you, Natalie. Yeah, from an attorney's perspective, working on these cases, it is quite challenging. It's definitely involved a lot of conversations about how we're going to pivot in this new reality. Some Zoom dialogue meeting attempts at very odd hours in California time. You know, I think that everybody is on board with doing their best to try to continue with the processes that we have open and try to make progress. But it is challenging. I think we're finding, especially that in this time of the pandemic, as we were discussing earlier, the power imbalance between the parties, some of the existing challenges in cases are just becoming even more stark when you add on to existing challenges, you know, community members having to join on a web platform that they're unfamiliar with. It's just one example. And of course, we have also seen in Arlington Partners cases around the world, issues such as you know, I think anytime that there's a global pandemic, it's a time when we often see rights being restricted. And unfortunately, there are some actors who take that as an opportunity to move forward on, you know, projects or agendas that might in normal times generate a lot of protest. And we have certainly had those issues coming up in our cases as well. Which, you know, from a peacebuilding perspective, in the long term, that's only going to result in more conflict and more violence down the road. Even if communities are not able to protest right now, that doesn't mean that everyone's okay with pushing projects through at this time.
Some of the ways we're dealing with that, Beth, are by really looking at what we can learn from past experience where there's been a natural disaster, for example. And our case in Haiti is a great example of that, where the rules were really given short shrift in doing a quick industrial park, standing up an industrial park quickly without really close attention to the need to do consultation and pay attention to those safeguards that were meant because we know people need protections. So this is a really important time for us to remember that all the international financial flows coming out in the form of COVID response really need to be focused on how can vulnerable communities access these in a way that meets their needs as they are defining them, not the needs of people sitting in capitals far away as they determine for people that those needs need to be met. So that's really, I think we have a lot of tools that we've created over the last decade. Zuazo is one of our tools you can read about on our website. We have a whole console, a database that we launched in November of all the grievances ever filed to every accountability office, about 1,300 of them, to understand how not to repeat the same mistakes we've made in the past. And now in a time of this pandemic, it's really critical that we learn those lessons, learn them quickly, and deploy financing with all of the protections and measures for accountability so communities can be heard quickly, heard effectively to resolve any disputes as they arise.
Great, and maybe one more question before I turn it back over to the World Affairs Council for some closing remarks. Natalie, any final thoughts on the relationship between peace building and accountability, and how have you been able to align these two imperatives so that they're not necessarily working against each other, but in fact with accountability comes the ability to instantiate a really durable peace in some of these environments?
Right, and I think this is also a tension that people talk about human rights vis-a-vis peace building as well, and what it means to defend someone's rights and receive accountability when someone's been wronged. And those, as we've shown in this video from Mongolia, and as the Mexico case describes, whenever there's harm to a community, from an advocate's perspective or the community's own perspective, what's always sought is restorative justice. How do I get restored to where I was before, as well off as I was before? And often the way that we operate as Accountability Counsel is simply understanding where are communities now, where's the farthest we can help them journey to get to where that mark is for what restorative justice looks like for them. And often it's a recognition, a very explicit recognition, it's not as far as they deserve. And that can be a really frustrating place to come to, but it's also seeing what the alternative is. And often the alternative is a very, very unsatisfactory attempt to use maybe a court system that is biased against Indigenous people, or corrupt or ineffective, or would take 10 to 20 years to access. So it's an imperfect system to begin with. I think communities, the peace building efforts that we're making through these accountability offices can get a long way there to create durable, lasting solutions, even if they don't meet a standard of fully defending or restoring rights.
All right, thank you. With that, I'd like to turn it back over to Philip for some closing remarks. Thanks everyone for joining us and for your great questions.
All right, so I've been asked to, okay, my video's all started. Okay, Beth, thank you so much for great moderating, and thank you so much to the Accountability Council's Natalie Bridgman-Fields and Caitlin Daniel for what was a really interesting program. You all are doing such great work. Thank you for joining us. So very quickly, with the time that we have, I know that in this time of sheltering in, you know, people are struggling in different ways. But one of the things we here at World Affairs know that you all still, because you're even here listening to these programs, you still want to make an impact. You want to hear what's going on in the world. So I just wanted to put you know, to the extent that you are able, we know that it's a difficult time for a lot of people, but to the extent you are able, consider supporting Accountability Council's work, either by donation or perhaps by joining their mailing list. By joining their mailing list, you can learn about how you can participate in their calls to action. These are efforts that are directing at influencing policymakers, and to even share these calls of actions with your network. We can also say that you can support the World Affairs program if you like what you're hearing here by giving a small donation. Anything would be helpful as we try to continue these regular webinars now doing this remotely. Let me just close by saying that next Thursday we have our next program, which is France's Emmanuel Macron, a European leader in the time of crisis, and you should be getting more information related to that. So and let me just close by saying thank you to you all. We hope that you're staying safe and healthy. And with that, why don't we sign off and go from there. Thank you.